It lasted only 4 minutes. 4 minutes that would forever change the trajectory of American politics and expose the most shocking collaboration in recent Democratic Party history. Kamala Harris had just finished presenting her grand strategy for Democratic unity. Her voice confident and measured as she outlined plans for bipartisan cooperation. The room hung on her every word, seasoned politicians nodding in agreement with the former vice president's vision. But there in the third row, Jasmine Crockett sat with a manila folder clutched in her hands. Her jaw set with the kind of determination that comes from knowing a truth that could shatter everything. What nobody in that room knew was that in exactly this young congresswoman from Texas would deliver the most devastating political confrontation of the decade, armed with documents that would expose a secret collaboration between Kamala Harris and Pam Bondi that went far deeper than anyone imagined. The silence that would follow her revelation would be so profound you could hear hearts breaking across the Democratic establishment. But to understand the magnitude of what happened that day, we need to go back 3 months earlier, to a rainy Tuesday night in Washington, D.C., when Jasmine Crockett was alone in her office, surrounded by boxes of documents, following a paper trail that would lead her to the most explosive political discovery of her career. It was 11:47 p.m. The Capitol building was nearly empty, security guards making their rounds, cleaning crews working quietly in the distance. But in room 149, Jasmine Crockett was wide awake, her eyes burning from hours of reading, her coffee growing cold as she sifted through hundreds of pages of California Attorney General records, Florida legal documents, and FBI surveillance reports that had been declassified under a Freedom of Information Act request she'd filed months earlier. What started as routine opposition research had become something much more sinister. The first red flag came in the form of phone records. Between January 2018 and December 2019, while Kamala Harris served as California's Attorney General and Pam Bondi held the same position in Florida, there were 47 documented phone calls between their offices, 47 calls between two attorneys general from opposite political parties, during one of the most contentious periods in American politics, when Trump was under investigation and Democrats were supposed to be resisting every Republican move. Why were they talking so much? The official explanation, buried in bureaucratic language, mentioned interstate law enforcement cooperation and sharing best practices for consumer protection. But Jasmine's instincts, honed by years as a civil rights attorney, told her there was more to this story. She'd seen enough political cover-ups to recognize the careful language designed to hide rather than illuminate. The breakthrough came hidden in a subsection of declassified FBI documents related to the Trump administration's final days, was a collection of personal notes and communications seized from Pam Bondi's office. Among them was a handwritten memo dated March 15, 2019, in Bondi's distinctive script. Kamala called again. She's worried about the California precedent, offered to share our Florida strategy in exchange for her backing off the voter suppression investigations. She's thinking so am I. This could work for both of us. Jasmine read the note 3 times, her heart pounding. She pulled up Harris's public statements from that same period, speeches about fighting voter suppression, interviews where she positioned herself as a champion of voting rights. But if Bondi's notes were accurate, Harris had been privately collaborating with one of Trump's most loyal allies to actually suppress investigations into voter suppression. The hypocrisy was staggering, but it was also something more dangerous. It was evidence of a sitting Democratic Attorney General making deals with the Trump administration while publicly opposing it. As dawn broke over Washington, Jasmine realized she was holding dynamite. But she also knew that accusations without ironclad proof would be dismissed as partisan conspiracy theories. She needed more evidence, and she needed to be absolutely certain of her facts before making any move. The next 2 months were a masterclass in investigative research. Working with a small team of trusted staffers, Jasmine began connecting dots that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. They found email exchanges between Harris and Bondi's staffs, ostensibly about procedural matters, but containing coded language that suggested ongoing coordination. They discovered that several voter suppression cases in California had been quietly dropped or downgraded during the same period when Harris and Bondi were in regular contact. Most damning of all, they uncovered evidence that Harris had received detailed briefings about Florida's voter suppression tactics and had implemented similar strategies in California, but in a more subtle way that avoided media attention. The collaboration wasn't just about phone calls or friendly correspondence. Harris and Bondi had been actively working together to perfect voter suppression techniques that could be deployed nationwide if Trump won re-election. They had been testing strategies, sharing data, and coordinating their legal approaches to ensure maximum impact while maintaining plausible deniability. By October 2024, Jasmine had compiled a dossier that read like a political thriller. Phone records, email chains, legal documents, witness statements from staffers who had been present during some of the conversations. And most importantly, Bondi's own handwritten notes detailing the scope and purpose of their collaboration. But having the evidence was one thing, knowing how and when to use it was another. Jasmine understood that timing would be everything. Too early, and the story would get buried in election cycle noise. Too late, and it might seem like sour grapes. She needed the perfect moment, when the revelation would have maximum impact and when Kamala Harris would be most vulnerable to the exposure. That moment came on November 18, 2024, during a closed-door Democratic Party leadership meeting, ostensibly focused on planning for the 20. Harris had positioned herself as the natural successor to lead the party, banking on her experience as vice president and her reputation as a progressive champion. The meeting was supposed to be a friendly discussion among allies, a chance for Harris to outline her vision and secure early support from key congressional leaders. The room was filled with Democratic heavyweights: Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and about 40 other members of Congress. Harris took the stage with characteristic confidence, her presentation polished and professional. She spoke about unity, about bringing Americans together, about the need for Democrats to work across the aisle to heal the country's divisions. She talked about her experience as Attorney General, her record of fighting for justice, her commitment to protecting voting rights. The irony was almost too much for Jasmine to bear. Here was Harris, presenting herself as a unifier and a defender of democracy, while Jasmine sat with evidence that she had secretly collaborated with one of Trump's most notorious allies to undermine the very voting rights she claimed to champion. As Harris wrapped up her presentation, she opened the floor for questions. Several colleagues asked friendly, softball questions about strategy and messaging. The atmosphere was collegial, supportive, almost celebratory, and then Jasmine Crockett raised her hand. The moderator, Congressman James Clyburn, recognized her with a smile. "Representative Crockett, do you have a question for the Vice President?" Jasmine stood slowly, the manila folder in her hands feeling heavier than it should. The room fell silent, not because they sensed danger, but because they were giving her their respectful attention. "Thank you, Congressman Clyburn." "Vice President Harris, I appreciate your presentation about unity and bipartisan cooperation, but I have a question about your past collaborations across the aisle." Harris smiled, clearly expecting a question about her work with Republican senators or governors. "Of course, Jasmine, I've always believed that we accomplish more when we work together. I'm specifically interested in your collaboration with Pam Bondi," Jasmine said, her voice steady but loud enough to carry to every corner of the room. "Could you explain to this room the nature of your relationship with her while you both served as attorneys general?" The smile faded from Harris's face. Around the room there were confused murmurs. Most people knew Bondi as Trump's loyal defender, but few were aware of any connection to Harris. "I'm not sure what you're referring to, Jasmine. As attorneys general, we occasionally communicated about routine legal matters." 47 phone calls over 2 years, Jasmine interrupted, opening her folder. "That's a lot of routine communication with someone who was simultaneously defending Trump's most controversial policy." The room's energy shifted. Conversation stopped. People turned to look at Jasmine, then at Harris, sensing that something significant was happening. Harris's voice took on a defensive tone. "Interstate legal coordination is a normal part of the job. I communicated with many Republican AGs during my tenure." "Did you communicate with all of them about voter suppression strategies?" Jasmine asked, pulling out a photocopied page. "Because I have Pam Bondi's personal notes here, dated March 15, 2019, where she writes, and I quote, 'Kamala offered to share our Florida strategy in exchange for her backing off the voter suppression investigations.'" The silence that followed was deafening. 42 of the most powerful Democrats in America sat frozen, trying to process what they had just heard. Harris opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "There's more," Jasmine continued, her voice growing stronger. "Email exchanges between your staff, legal documents showing that voter suppression cases in California were dropped or downgraded during the exact period when you were in regular contact with Bondi. And most damning of all, evidence that you implemented modified versions of Florida's voter suppression tactics in California." Nancy Pelosi, who had been sitting in the front row, turned to stare at Harris with an expression of complete shock. Around the room, Democrats were whispering frantically to each other, some pulling out their phones to take notes or send messages. "This is taken completely out of context," Harris finally managed to say, but her voice lacked its usual authority. "The communications were about legitimate law enforcement cooperation, legitimate cooperation. Jasmine's voice rose. While you were publicly positioning yourself as a champion of voting rights, you were privately learning from and collaborating with one of the most notorious vote suppressors in the country. And now that same Pam Bondi is Trump's nominee for Attorney General. That's not a coincidence, Vice President Harris. That's the continuation of a relationship that began when you were supposed to be fighting against everything she represented. The room erupted. Democrats began talking over each other, some demanding explanations, others calling for an immediate investigation. A UC stood up and shouted, "This is exactly why people don't trust politicians." Chuck Schumer was frantically making phone calls. The carefully orchestrated leadership meeting had devolved into chaos. But Jasmine wasn't finished. "You want to talk about unity, Vice President Harris? You want to talk about bringing people together? How do we trust someone who was secretly collaborating with our opponents, while publicly claiming to fight them? How do we follow someone who learned voter suppression tactics from Pam Bondi, and then pretended to be our champion?" Harris tried to regain control. "These allegations are serious, and I welcome the opportunity to address them properly, but this is not the appropriate forum." "This is exactly the appropriate forum," Jasmine shot back. "You're asking us to support your 2028 campaign, to trust you with the future of our party. We deserve to know who you really are, and who you've really been working with." At that moment something unprecedented happened. One by one, Democrats began standing up, not in support of Harris, but in support of Jasmine's demand for answers. First AUC, then Ilhan Omar, then Rashida Tlaib. Within minutes more than half the room was on their feet, applauding Jasmine's courage and asking the hard questions that needed to be asked. Harris looked around the room at the sea of standing Democrats, and realized that her carefully planned political future was crumbling in real time. Without another word she gathered her papers and walked out of the room, followed by her staffers and a handful of loyal supporters. The door closed behind her with a finality that seemed to echo through the building. In the aftermath, as Democrats tried to process what they had just witnessed, Jasmine remained standing at her seat, still holding the folder that had changed everything. She hadn't planned to destroy Kamala Harris's political career, but she had been prepared to tell the truth regardless of the consequences. The next 48 hours were a political earthquake. Harris's office issued carefully worded statements about routine professional communications, and mischaracterized routine legal coordination. But the damage was done. Major Democratic donors began withdrawing support. Progressive groups demanded investigation. Cable news channels ran segments asking whether Harris could survive the scandal. More importantly, other Democrats began coming forward with their own concerns about Harris's record, emboldened by Jasmine's example. The Harris-Bondi collaboration, which had been hidden in plain sight for years, became the thread that unraveled a much larger pattern of questionable political calculations and secret dealing. 6 months later, according to leaked reports, FBI investigations would reportedly confirm the accuracy of Jasmine's allegation. The full scope of the Harris-Bondi collaboration would allegedly be even more extensive than initially revealed, involving coordination on multiple legal strategies that benefited both of their political careers at the expense of the communities they were supposed to serve. Pam Bondi's confirmation as Attorney General would become significantly more controversial, with Democrats finally able to point to concrete evidence of her long-standing relationships with supposedly opposing political figures. But the most lasting impact of that November day wasn't the destruction of Harris's presidential ambitions, or the exposure of political hypocrisy. It was the demonstration that courage, preparation and commitment to truth could still triumph over political calculation and institutional loyalty. Jasmine Crockett had walked into that room as a relatively junior member of Congress. She walked out as a national figure, someone who had shown that the next generation of Democratic leaders wouldn't accept the compromises and secret deals that had characterized the previous era. The 4 minutes that changed everything weren't just about Kamala Harris or Pam Bondi. They were about the soul of the Democratic Party, and whether it would be led by people willing to tell hard truths, or by those who preferred comfortable lies. In those 4 minutes, Jasmine Crockett didn't just expose a political scandal. She issued a declaration that the age of unquestioned loyalty and behind-the-scenes dealing was over. The Democratic Party belonged to its voters, not its secret deal makers, and anyone who forgot that would face the consequences. As she later told reporters, democracy dies in darkness, but it also dies when we're too polite to turn on the light. That day in November, Jasmine Crockett turned on the lights, and what she revealed changed American politics forever.